So, hello, comrades. Welcome to this fourth session of Marxism 101. And our topic today is the state. What we mean by the state essentially is government in the broadest sense. It's not just parliaments or kings or lawgivers, but also the whole machinery of government, whether it's civil service or other kinds of institutions. In older societies, some of the institutions of the state probably merged in with some of the institutions of organized religion and so on. But the essence of a state, and this is what something which really, I believe, only communists really understand, only Marxist-Leninists really understand. The essence of the state is that it arises in class society due to irreconcilable class conflict. That is, you only have a state once you have a situation of private property, of exploitation, where of a ruling class which own the means of production and are in a position to exploit other classes of society. And they can only maintain that position through actual coercion, through direct threat of force or indirect threat of force. So Engels talked about this in The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, which is, really important sort of classic work that lays out this basic premise that the state arises in a situation where one class needs to be able to suppress other classes to maintain their special privileged position to exploit others. So one of the key characteristics, in fact, I think really the characteristic that sets a state off from any other form of social organization is the existence of special bodies of armed men, that is to say, armies. Now, we generally include police in that category as well in the modern world, but police forces as such are a relatively recent development. Even in, say, in England, the center of British imperialism, a permanent established official police force only came into being around the middle of the 18th century. So armies are, in a certain sense, the more classic form of the special body of armed men. But I don't think it can be emphasized too much that this is a key characteristic of a state, is that it's inherently coercive. Its fundamental purpose is to maintain the rule of the ruling class through whatever means necessary, up to and including violence and terrorism. And the state, therefore, is an instrument of class rule. It is not something that stands above the classes and mediates between them in an impartial way. It's true that the state does sometimes mediate between classes, but it never does so impartially. It always does so on behalf of the ruling class. So, for example, in the modern world, the rise of social democracy and the existence of various kinds of social services and social safety net and unemployment insurance and so on. These are still instruments of class rule in the sense that these policies are intended to mitigate the desperation of the working class in order to maintain a certain level of peace and stability. And they're not really designed entirely in the interests of the working class. And you can see that by the way in which many of these social services in many countries are cluttered up with bureaucracy and restrictions and forcing people who make use of those services to fill out forms and jump through hoops and having all kinds of restrictions on who can access them, who's entitled to them. So that in fact, they are actual mechanisms, just as much mechanisms of control, of maintaining a discipline over the working class as they are methods of helping working class people to stave off destitution. So So it is possible for a state to perform that function on behalf of the ruling class, of mitigating some of the effects of exploitation, but ultimately it's in the interest of maintaining the regime of exploitation. So Marx and Engels also pointed out, they talked about autocracy, which is with the rise of a very strong state or government, which will occur when classes are nearly equal in strength. When the class struggle has given rise to, or when the development of productive forces has given rise to classes, there's a change in the relative strength of the different classes. When it reaches a point where the entire mechanism of the control of one class is actually under threat, typically then the state takes on a much stronger and more intense form. And because it can play off one class against another, there can actually be a measure of autonomy within the institutions of the state. So still within the context of maintaining the rule of one class, you'll never find a state which just decides to go over to the side of the oppressed class. But you may find that the state as such develops more maneuvering room between the different classes and becomes more powerful in and of itself. One of the examples they give is the monarchies of the 16th, 17th century in Europe, with the rising bourgeoisie starting to threaten the power of the feudal ruling class. The monarchs, the kings of that era, actually became more powerful, where they had previously just been first amongst equals amongst the feudal ruling class, and where quite often a king might actually be elected by the feudal land owners. They became a much more powerful force in and of themselves, the absolute monarchies of that era. Of course, this could not stave off the inevitable progress of class struggle until it reached the point of the outbreak of bourgeois revolutions, where the old feudal ruling class was replaced. So a state could be a relatively mild and a relatively weak set of institutions. When the ruling class is in a very strong position, it can become a relatively strong and apparently partially independent set of institutions when classes are more equal in strength, the contending classes. But it still always is an instrument of class rule. So, and then coming back again to the role of the special bodies of armed men, it's really important for us to remember, this can hardly be overemphasized, that the role of the state is to be coercive. It's to keep the oppressed and exploited classes in their place. Any kind of other function that it fulfills will be temporary and secondary, and in a certain sense, optional. So even with, some people are actually, are a little taken in sometimes. They actually believe that, for example, that the police are there to protect us, the citizens, against crime, which to a certain extent may be true if you happen to be one of the citizens of the right ethnicity, class, income level, live in the right place, skin color, whatever it is within your society. But this is still a secondary role, even for the police. And it's a relatively new role that they only started to take on in modern times. Their fundamental role that doesn't change and doesn't go away is that coercive one. We certainly can see this very clearly in how the RCMP behaves when you have indigenous groups or their allies attempting to blockade pipelines. we saw it very, very dramatically and clearly in the police response to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the States, where they would stand with folded arms and watch, when fascist and far-right groups would demonstrate or riot or engage in quite violent and dangerous acts. But they're just incredibly aggressive towards peaceful demonstrators who were demonstrating on a strictly political level, making political demands. So I think, even just those two examples, the American police response to Black Lives Matter, the RCMP response to pipeline blockades, or similar kinds of indigenous stands on their own lands. It's really quite clear cut that it is not their role to find bad guys, to go and arrest burglars or murderers or anything like that. Their role is to suppress the movements of the mass of the people when those movements begin to threaten the power structures of the ruling class. So there have been many different forms of state, different forms of government in different historical eras. So I don't want to actually go in any great detail through the earlier forms of states, like the ancient empires and slave-owning societies and so on, but just really to focus on the modern form of the state, the bourgeois form of the state under capitalism. And here's where we have a new phenomenon, which is the nation state, which is actually a bourgeois invention. If you go back through taking a look at the social conditions, even like at the time of the French Revolution in France, or say the period of the revolution of Italy, of the Risorgimento, when the various small scattered kingdoms were being united into one country of Italy, that at those times there really was not a French nation or an Italian nation. In these countries, which in some ways are the epitome of what a nation state is, like one nation, one language, one government, they in fact did not all speak the same language. The dialects which became the national language were in competition with numerous others, were spoken by only a small percentage of the population. There was the very backwardness of feudalism meant that there were many, many isolated small subcultures within quite small regions of the country. And it was not a foregone conclusion at all that the boundaries of Frenchness, of France as a nation, say, would be drawn in their modern positions. It could possibly have taken in some parts of what's now Switzerland, which are the French-speaking parts. It could have left out, certain chunks of southern France, which spoke a quite different dialect, which might just as easily have been considered to be closer to Italian, and might have wound up on the other side of a border with Italy. So in a sense, the bourgeois revolution and the establishment of a central government and the borders that it creates, in fact, create the nation rather than arising out of a pre-existing nation. I mean, this is not always true, because sometimes there's a really clear-cut community that does all speak the same language and has a common culture and a common history and a sense of its own identity, that then strives for nationhood and strives to have a government which represents its nationhood. But in general, like even in Western Europe, which is the model form from which we get the concept of the nation state, the nation is a product of the rise of the bourgeois state rather than the source of it. So just another couple of points that I wanted to touch on quite just briefly. One is the concept of democracy. Now, the more directly political aspect of the state, that is the decision about who are the legislators, who appoints the judges, who is in the executive. In the modern world, there's a pretty overwhelming prejudice in favor of democracy. When I say prejudice, I don't even necessarily mean that it's wrong, because it's actually, it's a prejudice that we as communists share, at least with respect to what we want for the current situation, for the period of the struggle against capitalism. But in fact, democracy is a relatively newfangled invention. I think you can actually set aside the Greek democracy as it arose in Greece, which is so admired and held up in something that we're told about in our social studies classes, or at least we were when I was in high school. It was actually a very different form. It was called democracy, but in fact it was the ruling class operating as a committee of the whole, essentially, because only land-owning male free citizens were included in that democracy. It did not include foreigners, slaves, women, who were probably overall the majority. It still only embraced a minority of the population. In fact, the ruling class, the landowning male heads of households. But democracy, was in fact not well thought of until well into I'd say, probably at the beginning of the 19th century. Even in the 1790s, you can find political tracts from England, where the more conservative tracts would denounce Democrats as being worse than Republicans, worse than revolutionaries, worse than anarchists. Like being called a Democrat by the bourgeoisie in 1790s England would be like being called a communist in 1950s in North America. Democracy is not intrinsically congenial to capitalism, and in fact, it's a sort of a last-ditch attempt to make use of the state to mitigate those class antagonisms in such a way as to maintain their own rule. And we can actually see this in how late it is in the history of capitalism that anything actually approaching democracy, that is universal adult suffrage, how late it was in actually arriving in even the countries that many people mistakenly think of as being the most democratic and the ones who most cherish democracy. It's in my lifetime, right, that Indigenous people in Canada got the right to vote. It's in living memory that women in Quebec got the right to vote. And of course, we know that it's also like in our lifetimes, in living memory, that the right to vote was actually grudgingly extended to people of color in the United States, even though it had been officially on the books for 100 years. And we also know that there's a rearguard action taking place now to revoke that, like the attempts to deregister voters, the attempts to remove the franchise from people who've been in jail while simultaneously jailing more and more of the population for more and more trivial misdemeanors. So there's actually there's a struggle going on. It is quite dramatic and obvious in the States. There's an actual attempt to roll back democracy, because democracy has become a threat to the control by the ruling class. Enough people are in fact thoroughly fed up and starting to question the legitimacy of the existing regime, that they can't be trusted to be given a vote. So although we fight for democracy and we fight against any attempt to roll back democracy, we can see that the bourgeoisie and its servants don't have that same vulgar prejudice in favor of democracy. They're quite prepared to roll it back and to fall back on more autocratic and, in fact, fascistic methods. So, well, I have a number of other points that I've got on my notes here, but I think I want to just jump forward to talk a little bit about our conception of the proletarian state, like what happens after the socialist revolution. Now, socialist revolution could be a very prolonged, difficult, confused, complex process. And I don't want to say anything at all about just what I think it will happen. Like we don't have a crystal ball and we don't claim to. We have a goal and we have a strategy for how to analyze the situation and plot our strategy going forward. But the further into the future we go, the less we can say about the concrete conditions. But still, I think there are some very general statements we can make about what is the nature of the state in the period after the bourgeoisie has been overthrown and when there is a working class government. And that is, the state remains a set of institutions intended for the use of the ruling class to suppress the other classes in society. Except that under socialism, the ruling class will be the working class, which is in fact the great majority of the population. And the class who need to be suppressed would be the bourgeoisie, who will still be attempting to roll back the clock and overthrow this proletarian state and revert back to a capitalist situation, which we can certainly see. We know that to be the case because it has happened in the world. We know that there have been socialist states overthrown. So the proletariat definitely will still need its state. It will still need its organs of repression to prevent the bourgeoisie from simply overthrowing the nascent socialist order and reverting to capitalism. We also know that after the establishment of a working class state, the definitional form of, or the definitional feature of special bodies of armed men will not go away either. There will be need for armies and police within the socialist state. Certainly during the early periods when the threat of bourgeois overthrow is most intense and most likely to take the form of uprisings or foreign invasions or sabotage, direct acts against the government or the society. So we know that there will still be need for those things as well. That we do not pretend that the state will be a nicey thing during the period of the transition from capitalism to socialism and then the development of socialism towards communism. The state will not be nice. The state will be a repressive entity employing special bodies of armed men. It's just that it will be a state serving the interests of an entirely different class, the working class. And in this case, the working class being the great majority of the population. This will in fact be the first kind of state in history where democracy is really the form which is best suited to serving the interests of that class, where the organs of the state will be in fact committed to democracy rather than only giving into democracy grudgingly. And then finally, we can only say in the most vague and general terms, because it's far off in the future and has never occurred anywhere in the world, is when we actually reach the stage of the transition from socialism to communism, is that we will see a withering away of the state. That is, we really don't know exactly what that will look like. We don't know what the culture of that society will be. But what we can just simply say by definition is that once class conflict has been overcome, when there are no longer classes with clashing and contradictory interests, when essentially the entire society has become the working class, and the working class has become the entire society, that the need for a state to suppress other classes will disappear because there will be no other classes. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be differences of opinion. There might be furious debate over all kinds of social questions, but those will be debates within the ruling class, which will not require armies to suppress one side, one party to the discussion. So what withering away of the state might look like, we really don't know, but we can just say that if we accept the initial premise from the beginning of history, that the state arises when classes arise as an instrument of class rule, that the state will disappear when classes disappear and when there's no longer the need for one class to rule over the others. So I'm going to stop there and then just throw it open for general discussion.
When you said that the police are meant to